like to introduce Marjorie Sayre, who will introduce April. Marjorie is on the board of directors of the Vermont Humanities Council, so she's going to say a few words about the council.
The Vermont Humanities Council offers, would you believe, 1,700 events statewide during the course of a year. These include 12 different programs covering public affairs, reading, poetry to build the world of ideas and stronger communities. We deliver literacy programs for child care providers, at-risk middle schoolers, adult education programs, such as book clubs at the libraries, which Deborah is one of our people who, as you see, has one ongoing here at the library. All these programs are free. The VHC is not a state government funded organization. We are a non-profit organization that relies on all of you to help us. The first Wednesday series is in 9 towns in Vermont. Brattleboro consistently has the highest number of attendees, but I'm sad to say, the least amount of contributors. So on each one of your seat, along with your application to become library people, is also a donation form. I'd like to introduce to you April Bernard, who is a poet, a novelist, an essayist, who teaches literature and writing at Bennington College. She has 3 collections of poems. It's Blackbird Bye-Bye, which won the Walt Whitman Award for the Academy of American Poets, Psalms, and most recently, Swan Electric. Her novel, Pirate Jenny, appeared in 1990, and in 2003, she was the recipient of the Guggenheim Fellowship in Poetry. Her poems, essays, reviews, and travel pieces have appeared in numerous journals, including the New York Review of Books, the New York Times Book Review, the New Republic, The Nation, Newsday, Parnassus, and of course, Vanity Fair. A magazine and book editor in New York City for many years, she was a visiting writer at Amherst College from 1994 to 1997. And she's been on the faculty of the MFA writing seminars in Bennington since 1996. She received her BA from Harvard, and she has taught at Bennington since 1998. And really, she is not, she is a young, vibrant woman with this whole pedigree. So let me introduce Alice.
Now it's on talk. Probably you can hear me. Yes? Oh, excellent. Thank you, Marjorie Sayre, and thanks to the Vermont Humanities Council. Oh, it's rattling. And I want to thank Jerry Carbone, too, and this lovely library, where I've had the pleasure of reading before, but not of speaking. If I become inaudible, let me know. If I become inarticulate, it's just too bad. I love talking about Persuasion. It's my favorite novel of Jane Austen's. I'm assuming that most, if not all of you, have read it. Is that a fair guess? Oh, good. So I don't have to explain more than the basics. I'm going to do a talk and discussion. I expect the discussion will involve you. I'm a teacher, what can I tell you? I want to talk about the ways in which Persuasion is, as Virginia Woolf has written, a voyage of discovery, and how in this, her final novel, Austen breaks, or rather gently begins to break, from a lifetime's habit of essentially conservative thinking about society and the place of men and women in it. And I want to talk about how she does that. Who I am. I come to you from Bennington College, which famously has, since its inception in the 1930s, has had writers, active writers, teaching literature. What this means is that my great interest in the likes of Jane Austen does not derive from what you would call a literary critical perspective. You can fill in here whatever you like the least about academic criticism and decide I'm not going to be that. But I don't mean to crudely sweep all that aside. I read as much that falls under these categories, and I learn a lot from them. But that's not where my deepest interest lies. My interest in Jane Austen's magical novels is, first of all, the same as all of yours. A deep pleasure from the experience of reading them. And second, from a writer's eye view of what she does and how she does it. This is a fairy tale for grown-ups. And there's a variety of different ways in which this is carried out. Her fairy tales, like Pride and Prejudice, are for younger readers, I think. They're still wonderful. But this is the one that's for grown-ups. By the time Austen began writing Persuasion, which is her last completed book, it was 1815, and she was 40 years old, and actually for the first time in her life feeling like a success. This seems important, although I don't have much to do with the endless speculation about the relationship between her life and her books, but I'll talk about it if you want me to later. I think her sister Cassandra was wise to burn about 90% of her letters, leaving behind only the least personal bits. I'm sure it was Jane Austen's own request, and I think she knew what she was doing. She wanted her novels to stand alone. In any event, there is a different feeling in this novel that is often commented upon, how it is an older person's story, a story about second chances, and about how personal history can be considered and reimagined. And though Anne Elliot is all of 27 when the novel opens, she has lost her bloom in a family that prizes good looks and is already treated by her immediate family as a kind of spinster afterthought, the honor that nobody wants, but everybody makes use of. The implausibles that make this into a fairy tale, I think, can be cited very easily. A series of accidents that lead the Crofts to Kellynch Hall, that take Anne to Upper Cross, that Wentworth comes back from fighting not actually married, and culminating in the great happy accident of Louisa's fall and smashing her head. These are all happy accidents for the purposes of our heroine, and they're all very unlikely as they unspool. But everything else is very plausible. Only those coincidences are not, but she's so good at not letting you see that they're implausible that you accept them. Anne is a subdued heroine, surely, a sort of odd hybrid of the rambunctious Elizabeth Bennet of Pride and Prejudice and the mousy Fanny of Mansfield Park. Her family is appalling, and I'd like to take some time to look at her father. Mr. Elliot is such an incredible narcissist, I said to myself, and then I hesitated at the overused word. So I looked it up in the Diagnostic Statistical Manual, the DSM, and found the 9 characteristics of the narcissistic personality disorder. And here they are. 1, vain of personal appearance and accomplishments. 2, upon being criticized, reacts to criticism with anger and or shame. 3, expects special favorable treatment at all times. 4, has fantasies of absolute power, beauty, authority, and love. 5, cannot empathize. 6, habitually uses others to gain his own ends. 7, cannot listen to others. 8, thinks his own problems are so special they can only be understood by other special people. And 9, is envious of others. He's a 9 for 9. That's pretty good. By the way, you'll be astonished to learn, although I don't think Jane Austen would have been, that 75% of those with narcissistic personality disorder are men. I think even on the limited evidence of this novel, we could guess why. For although both daughters, Elizabeth and Mary, have inherited the Elliot DSM profile in 2 ways. Remember how Mary is always speaking of the Elliot profile. As women, they don't get the same scope to indulge it and express it as their father does. My point. Not simply that Austen was a canny observer of human behavior, and so canny, in fact, that she virtually anticipated the DSM, as did Shakespeare. That's another lecture. But my point here is how thoroughly despicable Mr. Elliot is. And indeed, he's the most despicable in a long line of despicable parents in Austen's novels, and we can go through them. There's the obnoxious, vulgar, insufferable Mrs. Bennet of Pride and Prejudice, and Mr. Bennet, who is too distant and sardonic and lazy. We have the ineffectual and too indulgent Mrs. Dashwood of Sense and Sensibility. We have the terrifying father of Northanger Abbey. We have the slug-like Lady Bertram of Mansfield Park and her too strict and too distant Lord Bertram husband. And we have the hypochondriacal father of Emma, who is such a washout as a parent that Emma must marry an alternate father in Knightley. So there we go. Finally, in Persuasion, we have the mother substitute, Lady Russell, who is loving but wrong, and in the end is forced to admit she's wrong. There was nothing less for Lady Russell to do than to admit she had been pretty completely wrong, and to take up a new set of opinions and hopes, is what the text says. And we have the unspeakable Walter Elliot. It's important that these parents are no good. When I said at the start that I was going to talk about Austen's conservatism, I'm of course using that word in the most old-fashioned, that is, conservative way. Austen was the daughter of a Church of England cleric. She was from the down-at-heels gentry class. She was born to a way of thinking that valued tradition and absolutely accepted the status quo of class and rank and land, the landed gentry. In so many ways, Austen was a product of the age that preceded hers, the Augustan age, and she had a great attachment to the Augustan age. She read and studied Samuel Johnson, and she modeled her glorious balanced sentences on Johnson, and like him in turn on the Latin models that she parsed. I proved that she was modeled her sentences on Samuel Johnson's, and literally, just before coming down here, I opened this book almost at random, and I could find two short little passages from two of Samuel Johnson's newspaper essays. The Rambler series is the first one. This is Samuel Johnson, writing circa 1751. Whoever commits a fraud is guilty not only of the particular injury to him whom he deceives, but of the diminution of that confidence which constitutes not only the ease, but the existence of society. He that suffers by imposture has too often his virtue more impaired than his fortune. But as it is necessary not to invite robbery by supineness, it is better to suffer, so it is our duty not to suppress tenderness by suspicion. It is better to suffer wrong than to do it, and happier to be sometimes cheated than not to trust. Doesn't that sound like Jane Austen? And here's another little one I liked from, I think, the Idler series. There is not, perhaps, among the multitudes of all conditions that swarm upon the earth, a single man who does not believe that he has something extraordinary to relate of himself, and who does not, at one time or other, summon the attention of his friends to the casualties of his adventures and the vicissitudes of his fortune, casualties and vicissitudes that happen alike in lives uniform and diversified, to the commander of armies and the writer at a desk, to the sailor who resigns himself to the wind and water, and the farmer whose longest journey is to the market. Now, I hope you can hear the balance in those sentences, the parallelisms that she constructs, and sometimes the actual Latinate arch of the sentences that she makes, which she makes and which Johnson makes from the Latin models. Anyway, in addition to admiring Samuel Johnson and other writers of the Augustan age, Austen praised king and country. She was an English patriot in thinking about the wars with France. None of these is surprising. But some of us perhaps might hope that a writer such as she might also have read and admired the proto-feminist writings of Mary Wollstonecraft. We have no evidence that she did. That she would have thrown her bonnet off to catch the winds of revolution and romanticism sweeping through the age she lived in. And for the most part, she didn't. At least not until this final book. And even then, it's a modulated, subdued sort of gesture. More like a little, the hat. So the thing that intrigues me about her fairly consistent portrait of bad parents, all of whom are shown up, or humored, or ignored, by wiser offspring, usually the heroine, is that this reveals all along a chink in the conservative predilections of the author. You can say with accuracy that a moralist could show us a bad king and still think the monarchy is a good institution. A bad parent may not damn all parental figures, surely. But so very many bad parents, also very, very misguided, suggests to me that Austen was nursing a rebellious attitude, even if it was confined locally within the family structure. And as I said, by the time we get to Walter Elliot, he's not only the very worst of all the parents portrayed thus far, he is bad not only as a parent, he is a bad lord of the realm. He is a failure as a member of the landed gentry. He loses his own house. At that opening of the novel, when Sir Walter's examining his favorite book, The Baronetage, always pay attention when a writer gives you something to read, and she wants us to see him reading here. There he found occupation for an idle hour and consolation in a distressed one. As he turned over the almost endless creations of the last century, and there, if every other leaf were powerless, he could read his own history with an interest which never failed. This was the page at which the favorite volume always opened on himself, Eliot of Kellynch Hall. What does Anne read? We learn from her conversations with the bereaved Captain Benwick that she reads poetry. She reads, in fact, the Romantic poets. Byron is named, as are Walter Scott's novels, and we can infer the others. She laments that it is, quote, the misfortune of poetry to be seldom safely enjoyed by those who enjoyed it completely. And she, quote, ventured to recommend to Captain Benwick a larger allowance of prose. Such works of our best moralists are cited. In short, she's recommending Samuel Johnson to him. What else does Anne read? She reads the newspapers, she reads the naval reports, and she keeps up with the world outside of herself. And what is there out in the world? Not only her beloved lost love, Captain Wentworth, but everything in this novel that he comes to represent. Independence from the land and the landed gentry, the making and taking a fortune on the high seas, and the world of Europe in a general uproar of revolution. That England's role in the Napoleonic Wars was essentially anti-revolutionary is not, I don't think, the point. The world is changing, and Anne is a part of it more than her father could ever be. Walter Elliot loses the family estate to the Navy, essentially, as he loses his best daughter to the Navy. Although there is a hint at the end of the novel that one day Captain Wentworth might be granted his own baronetcy, to the fury of Anne's sister Mary. What we are left with is a houseless but happily married wife of the Navy. And she is, we have been given a model for this happiness in her new sister-in-law, Admiral Croft's wife, who had said early on of her life on the ocean, I can safely say that the happiest part of my life has been spent on board a ship. While we were together, you know, there was nothing to be feared. Thank God I have always been blessed with excellent health and no climate disagrees with me. A little disordered, always the first 24 hours of going to sea, but never knew what sickness was afterward. That's Mrs. Croft. And like Mrs. Croft, after Anne marries Wentworth, we can presume we know she gets a nice carriage. She gets a landulette, one of those lovely names for a carriage. And we can presume that perhaps she and Wentworth drive along together as her sister and Admiral Croft do, and probably the happiest description of a happy marriage in all of Jane Austen. There's this description of Mrs. Croft and her husband driving together. My dear Admiral, that post, we shall certainly take that post. But by coolly giving the reins and better direction herself, they happily passed the danger. and by once afterwards judiciously putting out her hand, they neither fell into a rut, nor ran foul of a dung cart. And Anne, with some amusement at their style of driving, which she imagined no bad representation of the general guidance of their affairs, found herself safely deposited by them at the cottage. They are a happy-go-lucky, on-the-go, happy Navy couple. And they show how much in this, her final novel, Austen was looking with a cheerful eye to the world outside of her home, to the future, and I would say fully a resident at last of the 19th century. That's the gist of what I want to say about this book. I have several things I want to talk about that have to do with how Austen does what she does. And especially if you have your books, you will find this interesting. But even if you don't, I want to talk a little bit about some of her particular devices. Indirect discourse, which she uses beautifully in this book, that gives a coolness to those scenes of conversation in which Austen wants us to feel the texture of speech without the immediacy and excitement of real dialogue. And she uses it very, very heavily in this novel. There's an example I can give you at the start of chapter 13. Keep clicking. Does it keep clicking out there? No, it's just clicking in my ear. Never mind. They had an early account from Lyme the next morning. This is Louisa was much the same. No symptoms worse than before had appeared. Charles came a few hours afterwards to bring a later and more particular account. He was tolerably cheerful. A speedy cure must not be hoped, but everything was going on as well as the nature of the case admitted. In speaking of the Harvilles, he seemed unable to satisfy his own sense of their kindness, especially of Mrs. Harville's exertion as a nurse. And here's where it gets interesting, where Austen uses quotation marks but continues the indirect discourse, so that it's sort of halfway between the indirect and the direct. She really left nothing for Mary to do. He and Mary had been persuaded to go early to their inn last night. Mary had been hysterical again this morning. When he came away, she was going to walk out with Captain Benwick, which he hoped would do her good. He almost wished she had been prevailed on to come home the day before, but the truth was that Mrs. Harville left nothing for anybody to do. It's all over the place in this novel, and it's a very interesting sort of halfway point between the direct and the indirect. Now, there's a frequent feature, it shows up in one interesting little place in this novel, but if you're a fan of Austen's novels, you've probably noticed that there are places where various characters try to wrest the narrative away from either the central character or from the novelist herself. It happens all the time in Emma, and one of the ways to read Emma is to see it as a great contention among many people to tell the story of Emma, and they're fighting with each other all the time. There's only, and Emma is always trying to take it away too, but in this novel, there's one little place where this happens, and it's the presumptuousness of the young Mr. Elliot to tell Anne her own story. And this is near, let's see, where are we? Near the end of 76. I got tangled up here. Here we are. This is when they're sitting at the concert at Bath, and young Mr. Elliot is speaking to Anne. Yes, yes, I see you are. I see you know nothing of the matter. You have only knowledge enough of the language to translate at sight these inverted, transposed, curtailed Italian lines into clear, comprehensible, elegant English. You need not say anything more of your ignorance. Here is complete proof. She says, I will not oppose such kind politeness, but I should be sorry to be examined by a real proficient. I have not had the pleasure of visiting in Camden Place so long, replied he, without knowing something of Miss Anne Elliot. And I do regard her as one who is too modest for the world in general to be aware of half her accomplishments, and too highly accomplished for modesty to be natural in any other woman. And these moments when people in Austen's novels try to take the story away from each other are usually signs of important moments of rivalry and contention. And another thing that I find beautiful in this novel are her transitions, both the large scale and the small scale. And There are many, many, many of them. There's a very large transition moment between when Anne and Lady Russell are going back to Bath, and when they arrive there. It's very beautiful. And then there's a telling one at the very, very end of the novel, a small but perfect transition in the very last paragraph, where we make a transition from Mrs. Smith, the noble, suffering, sick lady. Mrs. Smith's enjoyments were not spoiled by an improvement of income, with some improvement of health and the acquisition of friends to be often with, for her cheerfulness and mental alacrity did not fail her. And while these prime supplies of good remained, she might have bid defiance even to greater accessions of worldly poverty. She might have been absolutely rich and perfectly happy, perfectly healthy, and yet be happy. Her spring of felicity was in the glow of her spirits, as her friend Anne's was in the warmth of her heart. Anne was tenderness itself, and she had the full worth of it in Captain Wentworth's affection. Very, very beautiful and careful transition there from the one to the other. And there's hundreds and hundreds of those that happen throughout this novel, which is part of its grace. There's lots to discuss, but I imagine you have questions and comments and problems we should address. So what are they? Oh, come on. You're thinking, okay. Yes?
The point you made before this last one about transitions, and you read a passage, and you were saying that it was an example of different characters wresting the story from each other.
Yes.
But I couldn't really follow your argument in that example, and I'm sure it was just that I didn't get it, but I wondered if you had another place to show it.
Not necessarily in Persuasion. I was more or less talking about some of the things that are characteristic of Austen's style. I'm sure there are other places in there. Even the business of what people are reading and how what they read becomes a version of their own story is a way of telling the story. But Austen likes to play around a lot with who gets to tell the story that she is telling. And she plays a game with that quite a lot. I mean, other novelists do too, but she does it most entertainingly, I think. Yes?
So what do you make about the conversation that Anne has with, I don't remember his
Captain
name.
Harville.
Harville, right, at the White Hart.
Yeah.
When he says, well, but, you know, the argument they have about who's more faithful, men or
Right.
women.
Right.
It's in some ways it's the heart of the novel. It's pretty. I think it's pretty self-explanatory though. So I mean, I'm happy to talk about it, but it seems to me that it's where Austen through Anne is saying that men and women may feel that each is devoted to each other and that they may feel that they suffer the most, but that men have other things to occupy themselves, so they get over it faster. And that that's a fact of life.
Right, but Harville says, you know, it's proved by all the literature. And then
Yes.
Anne says, I mean,
Yeah, but
no,
all the
Anne
literature
says
is
she's
written
read
by men, so which
You
is
guys have
which
read
is
it.
where Austen puts her delicate little foot into a kind of discourse about women that was not utterly uncommon at her time. I mean, she wasn't making this up. This was the kind of things that other sort of proto-feminist writers of the period were saying. It's just that she hadn't done anything like that in any of her books yet. Commenting like that in a social way on the position of women and what it does to their hearts and their lives.
And what it does, of course, is gives Wentworth hope.
Oh,
And he
yes. Oh,
overhears
yeah.
it.
Within the novel,
Right.
it's all adorable. I mean, it's beautifully managed and handled. When I think of this novel as Austen looking into the future, it's also one of those moments when she permits herself a kind of voice of a public, social voice, and says something about, you know, literature's written by men, so of course women don't get a fair shake in it. She says similar things throughout Northanger Abbey, which is a neglected great book, but she does it in a much more playful and less serious way. Yes?
A matter of genre. Would you speak for, and tell us how you have used the term fairy tale, which I completely agree with, how Persuasion fits the prototypical standard of a fairy tale.
Well, fairy tales actually don't have a prototypical standard. There are many kinds of fairy tales. What I tried to say, and maybe I didn't say it very clearly, was that there's a series of accidents, and there's also a series of tests. I didn't talk about the tests, but there are tests of the heroine. We come upon the heroine long after she's failed her first test, which is sort of one of the premises of a lot of fairy tales as well. She failed her first test because she was not true to her love when she was young. And then she gets another chance, and there are other tests that come to her, but most of the further tests that come to her are also in the form of questions of romance. So it's whether she will fall for the false love of Sir William Elliot, and whether she will stand firm and regain the affection of her first love. I think that's what I mean. There's no fairy godmother, for sure.
As a matter of fact, there's a reverse fairy godmother.
That's right.
Lady
That's
Russell.
right. But she's not exactly an evil fairy. But she gave bad advice. Yes, I think that the other thing that's magical and fairy tale-like about the story is how Anne recovers her bloom. She sort of starts living backwards. She starts out as a very old 27, and she winds up as a very young 27. So she sort of moves backwards in time in the course of the story by regaining her youthful bloom, but with sort of the wisdom of age. And that seems fairy tale-like to me.
I hadn't realized that you spoke tonight, just now, how close this is to Shakespeare's romances.
Yes. 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 Although she doesn't go running around in boys' clothes. Yes.
I'm interested in your observations about her sense of the world, because so many of Austen's heroines seem outrageously cocooned. The Dashwood sisters just have no idea what's happening.
Right.
And I mean, can you make anything of the fact?
Absolutely.
Yeah. What would you
Well,
make of that?
one of the reasons the Dashwood sisters have no idea what's going on is because Austen was very clear about what she could write about, and she said, "I will not write about that I do not know about." And she was comfortable writing about the very closed world of the landed gentry and the 2 or 3 families, or what's it, 3 or 4 families in a little town as in Emma. That's ideal. But what I think is that because she had 2 brothers in the Navy, because she was herself 40, because she was past the age where she knew she was not going to get married, and because for the first time in her life she had a little bit of worldly success, with actually quite a lot, with the publications of Sense and Sensibility, Pride and Prejudice, Mansfield Park, and Emma, she was becoming herself a little more worldly. It wasn't like she wasn't running around in the literary circles of London. That never happened to her. But she had worldly attention paid to her work. She was able to think about the world outside herself. And even when you consider how, she sends Anne off to sea, and the only thing she knows about the world of being at sea is from her brothers. But she had 2 brothers in the Navy who were very comparable in terms of their level of success with Captain Wentworth. So she does know that world, and she does read the Navy lists, and she does read the newspapers. So what she's envisioning for her heroine is something that she might have, in a way, longed for herself, which is to get out into the wide world. It also seems truly important to me that she is imagining this world of the Navy, and the world of the Navy is the first important time in English history when men were able to make themselves into men of substance and even get baronetcies in ways that were regarded as utterly respectable, that were not from the landed gentry. There were other baronets who'd been made baronets because they'd made a lot of money in trade, but they were always looked down on. one of the things she's very clear about in this novel is that there was a new generation of admired men of public life who were the Navy men because they had saved England, and they were heroes. So they had a new status, which gave them a status comparable to the landed gentry. Not to the aristocracy, but certainly to the landed gentry. And that this was something you could achieve by your own abilities and intelligence and merit. It's not exactly the French Revolution's idea of democracy, but it's much closer to a democratic ideal than anything else that Austen and her family and her kind had seen before. And that's part of what I think she found exciting. So when she's sending her heroine off onto the ocean, I think she's sending her off into the 19th century after a life of living very much in the previous century.
So isn't that different from conservatism?
Yes, that's when she breaks her conservatism. That's my point, is that she's not done with it. She's always going to have very conservative ideas of how men and women should behave, and she hasn't utterly repudiated. I'm not suggesting that Jane Austen sitting at her cottage is repudiating the landed gentry, but for the purposes of this book, she has, imaginatively with this heroine. Yes. So that's how she breaks the conservative habits of a lifetime. Yes?
When you were talking earlier about mechanics and how Jane Austen writes,
Yeah.
you mentioned something about the indirect and the direct,
Yes.
and I didn't get it, and I wonder if you could repeat that or expound on
Sure.
what that is.
It's direct versus indirect discourse. Direct discourse is, shut the door, he said. Indirect discourse is, then he said, we should shut the door. Okay? But she does something in the middle, which it puts it in quotes and has it virtually identical to actual speech, except that the I is the third person. So the passage I was giving you moves from standard indirect discourse to the kind of indirect discourse she uses all over the place in this novel.
Could you wave your fingers like this when you're starting to quote?
I will wave my fingers. Let me see if I can just find it, for heaven's sakes. Here we go. This is standard indirect discourse. This is Charles's report. They had an early account from line the next morning. Louisa was much the same. No symptoms worse than before had appeared. Charles came home a few hours afterward to bring a later and more particular account. He was tolerably cheerful. A speedy cure must not be hoped, but everything was going on as well as the nature of the case admitted. In speaking of the Harvilles, he seemed unable to satisfy his own sense of their kindness, especially of Mrs. Harville's exertions as a nurse. Quote, she really left nothing for Mary to do. He and Mary had been persuaded to go early to their inn last night. Mary had been hysterical again this morning. When he came away, she was going to walk out with Captain Benwick, which he hoped would do her good. He almost wished she had been prevailed on to come home the day before, but the truth was that Mrs. Harville left nothing for anybody to do. End quote. So you see? It goes into actual speech, but retains that distinction of the third person.
Is he supposed to be saying that?
Yes.
So he's saying he about
that,
himself.
but he...
Right, but he isn't. That's the point. It's in the middle. It's in the middle between indirect discourse and direct discourse.
So
It's something she's very fond of.
So he is Charles in
Yeah,
that, but
yeah,
he's
yeah.
speaking. So
Yeah.
that, actually, no one would actually do that, would they?
No.
Because it's, okay, great.
Only
I'm
Jane
getting-
Austen. I mean, I'm sure there are other writers who've done it, but I'm not aware of them.
Yeah.
And she does it in other novels, but she does it especially in this one. And I think it's just something she's playing around with. It's one of those sort of devices that she's interested in. And I think that it's an interesting place to be between the direct and the indirect. And it's like walking a little tightrope. Yes.
I'm interested in what you said earlier about Emma.
Yes.
I've just had the great good fortune for weeks now of listening to a tape, a cassette, CD in my car of Emma that is fairly new. My daughter gave it to me.
Is it a good reader?
Yeah, it's, I can tell you, excellent actress. And of course, Emma is full of all these conversations where people come in, and this wonderful actress just gets the voice right. It's Brunel Scales.
Oh, yes.
Yeah. And
Oh, my hero.
I know,
love her.
but I've never
That's
done, I've read Jane Austen all my life, but I've never had an experience with this book that I've had listening to this CD with this wonderful actress.
Prunella Scales is fantastic.
Yeah, I recommend go out and get the.
Did you notice what I was talking about?
Yes.
That there are many characters who try to take the story away from the narrator. Emma herself is constantly, I mean, the whole novel is about Emma trying to run other people's lives, which as far as we can tell, only the author of the novel is allowed to do. Because she made these people up, and then one of her characters is running around trying to run their lives for her. But she's not a surrogate, she's a competitor. And then Harriet starts trying to do it. And certainly the secret lovers are trying to write it. Everybody's sort of yanking the story away from
Not to
each other.
mention all the butterfly old ladies.
Yes. Oh, and then there's the dreadful, dreadful Mrs. Elton.
Oh.
And Mrs. Elton sets herself up as the chief opposing narrator to Emma. Because it's been Emma's story too long, and so Mrs. Elton arrives and wants to tell the story herself. But that's very much part of the game that Austin's playing. Yes.
Has anyone, any other writer done that and used that technique?
Which?
This, trying to arrest the story?
Oh, I'm sure many have. I mean, Shakespeare does it all the time. I mean, Austen learned everything she knows from Shakespeare, and there's always, especially in the comedies, but also in the romances, there's usually a character who's trying to stage manage, direct, star in, and write the play, and has to be, and usually a couple people who want to take it away from him or her. Yes, sir.
I'd like your thoughts on this, but I can't bear to have you say that Lady Russell wasn't a great character.
She was.
Well, you said she gave really bad at Black Vice,
Terrible.
and I don't think she did.
She.
I think she was as close as Anne came to have a really caring parent, and her advice, I think, was the best she knew. And she was
Yes.
a fairly independent, strong woman on her own. So
Yes.
she wasn't giving advice from a place of fear or.
No, she's just wrong. She's not a bad person, but she's wrong.
We don't know, had she, if.
There was nothing
If
less
she
for
had-
Lady Russell to do than to admit that she had been pretty completely wrong, and to take up a new set of opinions.
But that's another reason I really like her, is that she's willing to admit a mistake and change. Like many of us.
I think we would all like her personally. But I like lots of people who are wrong all the time. and in any case, although she is by far the most benevolent version of this, I think she's maybe perhaps a little bit like Mrs. Dashwood. She's in Sense and Sensibility, Eleanor and Marianne's mother. She's timid and worried and has her own concerns, isn't unlovable, but is not the most, but is a parent whose views have to in some way be overturned in order for the heroine to survive. That's my only point. Not that she's a wretch or anything, or bad, but merely that she represents a point of view that has to be undone for the heroine to succeed, which is the younger generation, which is what I'm suggesting is how Jane Austen feels about that level of rebelliousness in all of her novels. Over here.
I am always delighted by Jane Austen's sense of irony. And you've touched on two things that I have always taken as ironic. And I'd like to suggest them to you and see what you say. One of them is that Anne Elliot and Captain Bennick talk, as you had said, about the idea that novels are all written by men. But of course, we're kind of inundated with the mysteries of Udolpho and that. And I always assumed that this is a matter of a person saying something and another agreeing to it, when both of them, reflecting, would have known that even the male names on books would have been representative female writers.
Well, that's actually not quite true.
Well,
the mob of scribbling women hadn't taken over yet. And what Harville and Anne Elliot are talking about is the moralists and the philosophers, who, not the novelists, who have written, if I missaid that, I misspoke, who are writing about women and men and men's capacity to love forever. So I don't think that's an ironic conversation. I think it's one of the most sincere moments in the book, in fact.
The other thing that I wondered about was Sir Walter. He's a baronet.
Yes.
He's not a baron, he's a baronet.
Right.
And historically, the baronetage has been created specifically for the purpose of raising money by selling titles to anybody who would be willing to pay for it.
Yes.
And I had, this was something that struck me as being very like Bingley girls talking about how Sir William Lucas might have kept a very good shop, when in fact that's where their money came from. Sir Walter is kind of a fraud, isn't he? Just
Well, there's that kind of baronetage, and then there's the baronetages that were actually put in place by Charles II when he came back onto the throne, and he was building up his posse by creating more aristocrats once he came back on the throne. So there's at least two big waves of the baronetage, and the first big wave, I think, which we have the implication Sir Walter is from, was that the original fake aristocracy of Charles II rather than the later ones, so that he's got at least some claim to at least a couple hundred years, or 100, what is it, 150 or something years that count.
I think there's something genuine.
But of course, you know that the people who are latecomers to such honors are the most proud of them. So it makes perfect sense. Over here, there was a question. Yeah, you.
Yeah, going back to the question of Lady Russell, what is your opinion or your take on Anne's feeling about that advice that Lady Russell gave her? Because I seem to remember at the end of the novel, she's speaking with Captain Wentworth, and she says something to the effect that she doesn't blame Lady Russell for giving the advice, nor herself for having taken it.
Right.
And I always thought that was kind of an interesting.
She's talking about the fact that in the novel there's this, it's an unresolved ambiguity of the novel, because Anne tells herself when she's talking with Captain Wentworth that she doesn't blame herself, she doesn't blame Lady Russell for having given her the bad advice, and she doesn't blame herself for having taken it, because with what they knew at the time, I mean, it's one of those, with what I knew at the time, I didn't know at the time, and so the problem appears to have been that she didn't tell Captain Wentworth at the time that he should come back and ask her again in 2 years when he'd made some money, or that he just didn't come, or that he was so outraged and prideful that he wouldn't come back. But it's really, I think it's fudged in the way that human beings fudge those things. That's what I think. I think that the novel wants us to see that it was wrong. But that Anne, because she's a person who doesn't go around blaming herself too much, or somebody she loves, comes up with this sort of double talk explanation. Well, if I'd known, but I didn't know, and so I can't really blame myself, but it was wrong, but it isn't, but that sort of thing. I think that's what Austen is showing us. Yes?
I want to talk about Captain Wentworth. When he first came back, and he said somebody, oh, he would hardly have known her.
Right. She lost her bloom.
Lost her bloom, right. But then when he begins to, and then he carries on with all these other girls, which I thought was kind of shallow of him, the way he was carrying on with these other two girls. And was he trying to make her, I don't know what was going on there. And then when he sees that she's really such a superior person, she has such good.
Well, there's a lot of explaining that has to be done about Wentworth's flirtatiousness, but I guess he's a flirtatious guy.
I think so.
I think that's just who he is. I mean, we wouldn't like it as much if he wasn't.
But doesn't he try to explain that he was trying to fall in love with somebody else? Because
yes, and his sister says, he's just ripe for the picking. Any girl that winks at him will get him. And I mean, he's been at sea, as they used to say in the movies. I haven't seen a woman in 6 years. Or whatever.
What do you think about the fact that Anne is a middle child, and in Jane Austen's other novels, there's the younger daughter, the older daughter, or the two that play upon each other, or, what's the thought on
She's
that?
very alone, isn't she? She's there. What I think it's more important that she's very alone, even within this family of sisters, and that there are pairs of sisters in Pride and Prejudice and Sense and Sensibility, and then there are the solitary heroines, and she's one of the solitaries. No matter where she fell in the birth order, I think it's just that she's alone because she has no one to confide in. I mean, her sisters are useless, and the other alone heroines are Catherine, but she's not really alone. She's just visiting strangers, so she doesn't have a sister to confide in, and Fanny and Emma. And Emma doesn't have a confidant because she doesn't have sisters, but also because she's superior, both in real and imagined ways to everyone else. Yes?
I have wondered for a long time, why is it that Anne Elliot is regarded as practically a spinster and Elizabeth is not?
Because Elizabeth is the eldest and is a beauty. And because the vanity and narcissism of the father and daughter are such that they can only see her as eligible, even if she's past the age of eligibility. It's an internal belief of the family rather than anything based on reality.
Is that something that you think that was done on purpose by the authors, making it?
I'm sure she'd observed such phenomena.
Well, I'm just wondering whether she intends the reader to ask that question.
No, I think she explains it pretty well. I mean, she does explain to us that Anne has always been retiring, has always sort of hung in the background, has always been useful, has always been the one who did all the work, and that Elizabeth and her father have a kind of weird sort of, they're like a couple, they go out in public together. He only takes her to London. She's always been the favored.
Like a son.
Yeah, like a son, only a daughter.
But
Sort of.
Elizabeth is worried about getting
Yes.
old. She closes that marriage
Yes,
book
she does.
because she doesn't want to be
Yes.
reminded. So she's very aware of that.
Yes,
I
she
wouldn't
is.
say she-
But her father isn't. And her father is the one who determines where people sort of stand in the family. Yes.
When you said that sending Anne and Wentworth off on boats at the end was possibly moving into the 19th century, is there any knowledge that Austen read Wordsworth or Coleridge or?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. She read and loved the Romantic poets. Oh, very much so. Yes, there's lots of evidence that she did. She was widely read in the Romantics and liked them very much. She just thought that she just has a character advise another character to moderate it with a little prose, because he's in a dangerous emotional state, and we wouldn't want him to get too excited. No, she loved romantic poetry. Yeah. Well, have we wound it up? Oh, no, I guess we haven't. All right, yes.
To go from the sublime for a moment, I'm wondering, you as an Austen scholar, who's the close reader of Austen.
Close reader, much better.
What you in the academic world or others thought of the popular book, Jane Austen book club and movie that has come
Well, you're not going to get much change out of me on that one, because I didn't read it, and I haven't seen it, and I don't care. But I care because you asked, but it's just, I mean, sure. I mean, if I had time. But I'd rather reread Persuasion. Yes, over here.
I was interested in the beginning how you spoke about the wisdom of her sister's decision to burn her letters.
Yeah.
And I'm new at reading tons of, well, I've been reading Austen for a long time, but I started to read about her life, and I was heartbroken when I just read that several weeks ago, because I've been happily reading a lot of Virginia Woolf's letters. And so I just thought all those beautiful sentences that were
You know that there's a really lovely edition of Jane Austen's letters. She wrote a lot to her sister, is the point. So about 10% of the letters to her sister exist, and her letters to her other members of the family, and lots of other incredibly entertaining, marvelous letters exist. So don't worry, don't feel too bad. But the stuff about her love life, we'll never know, which is the way she wanted it. Yes, Karen.
So what is your opinion of why she's so intensely popular in this particular time in our
Boy, I don't know. I don't know. She's been popular with me since I can remember, so it doesn't seem striking to me. I mean, I've always loved Jane Austen since I could read, practically. But I've certainly, I mean, you'd have to be an idiot not to notice that there's all these movies and everything else. I don't know. I think quality lasts, you know, like a good suit. I don't know. I don't know. I think maybe she handles the English language in a way that I think is immensely pleasing to the ear, And perhaps at times when the English language is being battered by popular culture, it's especially pleasing, it's refreshing to the ear to see these sentences, to read them, to hear them. That's part of it. I don't think it's just because there's stories about girls getting married. I think that wouldn't go very far. And it certainly wouldn't, they're so out of date. You know, that's not why. It's not because we can identify, as my undergraduates are always saying, I can't identify. But you know, that's not the point. I mean, I think it has to do with the quality of her writing, and the way that she tells stories, the prose. It's just beautiful. It's refreshing.
Why did you say you were so glad that she burned those letters?
Because I have strong opinions about biography, which probably would take me another hour. But I think it's a mistake. First of all, because I think that was Jane Austen's right to do. And she obviously asked her sister to do it, so I'm glad her sister did it. I think that if she wanted us to know about her private life, she would have left those letters, but she didn't. And so I'm happy for her that what we have is this. I don't think it's any of my business.
I do.
No. Might be your business, but it isn't mine.
I would love to know.
No, I just reread Mansfield Park. That'll tell you more. Yes. Yeah.
My sister and I have between us several daughters who gradually have been turning 16, and we've made a pact between ourselves that every time one of the girls turns 16, we give them Pride and Prejudice. Because we
I hope that was a promise, not a threat.
You know, every single one of these girls has adored Pride and Prejudice.
I hope you give it to boys too.
Well, we don't have as many boys at that age in the family.
Well,
I mean, we happen
nonetheless.
to be profligate with girls or something, but, and I might, but I would be an older boy, I think.
Well, my 11-year-old son, granted he's my 11-year-old, likes Pride and Prejudice just fine.
My husband fell
hilarious.
in love with it, and like 64, we read to each other and loved it, but I don't know, I didn't try it on my son. I should have. I'll try it. I'll give it to him for Christmas.
If I may comment on Winnie, your response to it. For years I've taught Pride and Prejudice, and the response of the teenage male and the response of the teenage female are totally different, and then many times face to face, well, how can you say that? In fact, they just, all boys should read it as well. Particularly this age of feminism.
I was just going to say that when I met my husband, when we first met, and he told me he read Pride and Prejudice and loved it, I decided he was safe to date.
It's an excellent way. It's an excellent catch. I think that's probably it for now. But if any of you have things you're